There was a time when you couldn't wait for their messages. You'd check your phone, replay the conversation, wonder what they were thinking. Even a small change in their tone could occupy your mind for hours. And then, somewhere along the way, something changed. You still love them, you still enjoy being around them, but you don't think about them quite as much. The conversation feels easier, the surprises become fewer, and one day you find yourself thinking, why does this feel boring now? Maybe that is the wrong question to ask. Because before asking why your relationship become boring, shouldn't we ask something more basic? What exactly changed? And even more importantly, why did you decide to call that change boring? Because think about it. Maybe the conversation have become flatter, maybe the anticipation has decreased, maybe your interactions have simply become predictable. But notice something. These are all observations. Something changed in the experience of the relationship. But none of these observations by themselves say this is boring. So why did you call it that? Why didn't you call it stable, comfortable, safe, that I don't have to perform anymore? This gives us two different questions. What changed and why did you interpret that change as boring? Question number one, what changed? Think about the beginning of the relationship. You didn't know what they were going to say. You didn't know how they would react. You didn't know whether they liked you as much as you liked them. You were discovering their habits, their stories, their moods, the little things they noticed. And because so much was unknown, your attention kept running to them. A message could change your mood. A date could stay in your head for the rest of the night. You might replay something they said, wondering what they meant. There was always something left to discover. There was novelty, there was uncertainty, and there was a lot of attention directed toward this person. But as the relationship continues, some of that uncertainty naturally disappears. You learn their habits, you know their stories, you recognize their reactions. You know what they're probably going to order, right? The person hasn't necessarily become less interesting. You simply have less left to figure out. And that changes the experience of the relationship. There is less novelty, less uncertainty, and less need for your attention to constantly return to the question, who is this person? So yes, something has changed. But notice what we haven't established yet. We haven't established that the relationship became boring. We have only established that the experience changed. And this is where the question gets interesting. Because two people can experience almost the same change and arrive at completely different conclusions. One person who is going through this change will think, I don't feel what I used to feel. And the other thinks, I finally feel safe enough to stop performing. One calls it boring and the other calls it peaceful. One thinks something has disappeared and the other thinks something has finally arrived. So what is actually happening? If the relationship became more familiar for both of them, why did one experience familiarity as loss while the other experienced it as love? So question number two, why interpret that change as boring? Maybe the difference isn't in what happened. Maybe it is in what each person expected love to feel like. Because somewhere along the way, long before we enter our first serious relationship, we begin building an internal picture of love. Not a conscious definition, more like an expectation, an idea of what love is supposed to feel like. For one person, love might become associated with excitement, with anticipation, with intensity, with constantly thinking about another person. And for someone else, love might become associated with trust, with being understood, with emotional safety, with not having to perform, with finally feeling at home. And these expectations matter because we don't experience our relationship in isolation. We are constantly comparing what we are experiencing with what we think we are supposed to be experiencing. Imagine someone whose internal picture of love is built around excitement. At the beginning, everything fits. They think about their partner constantly. They feel nervous before meeting them. Every message feels significant. The uncertainty itself feels exciting. And without realizing it, they start using those feelings as evidence. This is what love feels like. And months later, when the relationship becomes familiar, that uncertainty fades. That anticipation becomes quieter. The emotional spikes become less frequent. And now there is a mismatch. The relationship is still there, but the experience no longer matches the person's internal picture of what love was supposed to feel like. And the mind has to explain that mismatch. And maybe the easiest explanation is something is wrong. And eventually, maybe I'm bored. And then something even bigger. Maybe I'm falling out of love. Notice what happened. The person did not simply observe that the excitement has decreased. They interpreted that observation that the love has decreased. And someone with a different internal model of love can experience the same decrease in excitement very differently. They might think, I don't have to constantly wonder anymore. I can finally relax around this person. I don't need the intensity to know that I love them. The same familiarity that feels like loss to one person can feel like safety to another. The same predictability can feel like boredom to one person and home to another. Of course, this doesn't mean every feeling of boredom is a misunderstanding. Sometimes something really is wrong. A relationship can become emotionally disconnected. Needs can go unmet. Curiosity about each other can genuinely disappear. Sometimes I am bored is the mind's imperfect way of describing a real problem. And that is precisely why the word matters. Because boring is not the diagnosis, it's a description of an experience. Before deciding what that experience means, we have to understand what is underneath it. So maybe relationships don't simply become boring. Maybe something more subtle happens. The relationship changes. The uncertainty becomes familiarity. The anticipations become predictability. And the intensity becomes something quieter. And then we look at that new experience through whatever model of love we have carried with us. For one person, the quiet feels like loss, and for another, it feels like peace. So the more useful question is not simply, why did my relationship become boring? It is, what actually changed? And then, what did I expect that change to mean? Because sometimes the thing that has changed isn't the amount of love you have, it's the way that love feels. And those two things are not necessarily the same. See you again.